Welcome back. I'm Uday Pratap Singh. You're joining us on NewsX exactly 30 days after the ill-fated Air India 171 crash. The Aircraft Accident Investigation Bureau has released a preliminary report detailing the incident. The crash report details that both the engines shut down within seconds of takeoff and that Engine 1 and Engine 2 fuel cutoff switches transitioned from run to cutoff within 1 second of each other. According to the AAIB, both engines of the ill-fated aircraft experienced a momentary recovery after an initial loss of thrust, but ultimately failed to stabilize. The crash ultimately led to the deaths of 260 people. AAIB said the wreckage site activities, including drone photography and videography, have been completed, and the wreckage has been moved to a secure area near the airport. Well, joining us now to discuss this preliminary report is a very special guest. He will help us further decode this report and the happenings around it, also its ramifications. We have live Captain Ross Imer, also known as Captain Ross Rusty Imer. Captain Ross is the CEO of Aero Consulting Experts. He's also one of the most experienced pilots in the world. He has over 60 years and 34,000 hours of worldwide heavy jet experience. Welcome. Thank you very much for being with us today, Captain Ross Rusty Imer. Well, let me begin by asking you what your assessment is of the cause of this disaster after you have studied and read the preliminary report released.
I'm very careful in commenting on a case which is not completely resolved yet. As you know, we only have a prelim report, although this is much better than prior to the prelim report. That there was, as you know, there was incredible amount of misinformation on YouTube. All these so-called experts on YouTube, they have these crazy ideas about the cause of this crash, and they were sticking with it. At least this prelim report tells us, for example, some of those assessments were completely wrong. And as you know, they are focusing on this fuel cutoff switches. There are three theories that I can think of, but again, I'm going to wait till the report is completely done, where they definitely, because they leave some questions unanswered. For example, 3 seconds past liftoff at 180 knots, the two cutoff switches are placed one by one, first number one, then number two, into cutoff. Now, at first glance, it is impossible for those switches to move on their own. It's absolutely impossible. The design of these switches are that to prevent any problems like bumping the switch accidentally, you cannot bump those switches and turn them off. So either someone had deliberately turned those switches to cut off, or they were doing what we call a memory item from a checklist that is for dual engine failure. That's on the, it's two items on this checklist. It's memory item for every pilot that flies a 787. And it says fuel cutoff switches to off and back on, and activate the RAT switch for 1 second. So I'm thinking they're either responding to a dual engine failure, which they're doing the correct procedure, or those switches possibly, it's a mechanical switch. Anything mechanical is possible to a failure. It's possible that those switches vibrated themselves off. Now that's one in a probably a billion chance. But somewhere in that report, in the 15-page report, if you read the report, it mentions there was apparently must have been a case for FAA to issue a warning to the airlines. Not a warning, but a mention that this could possibly happen. But it was not a mandatory, therefore Air India did not follow that. So if those switches are loose, for any reason, the spring is not working or spring is broken, there is always a possibility that those switches may have vibrated themselves into the off position. Because the other thing is that the non-flying pilot, in my opinion, who was the captain, was not flying. He was handling the radio at that time. The co-pilot has both of his hands on a control wheel as they rotate. He's not touching those switches. So it must have been either the captain turning off those switches and turning them back on, or they vibrated off. Those are the two cases. And that's why we hear in the report someone saying, why did you turn off the fuel control switches? And I suspect that it was the non-flying pilot, who was the co-pilot, asking the captain, why did you do that? And he responds, I didn't do it. So that's very unusual. Either he did it or he did not. Why would he lie? And that's why I'm thinking we need to pay attention to every possibility, including a possibility of those switches failing on their own. Now you may ask, how could it possibly these switches fail on their own and drop off? Some of the pilots of my era, my age group, we were kind of anal or very precise, if you might put it in a better way. We wanted to do everything perfectly. In other words, if the ATC told us 250 knots, we flew 250 knots, not 251, not 249. If they say heading 090, it was not 089 or 091. It was exactly precisely. And the same thing goes, and I'm guilty of it myself. When I started my takeoff roll, I would stick to the center line of the runway so much that those, we call them centerline lighting. It's a kind of a turtle shape, stainless steel housing with two lights on each end. And it's slightly protrudes over the concrete of the runway. But your nose wheel, if it's right on the center line, you hear the bump. First starts with bump, 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 bump as you increase your speed. But in my mind, I'm saying to myself, I'm on the center line. And that's one of the things that pilots of my generations really wanted to do that. And you might call it, like I said, anal, being anal, and you want to do everything perfectly. So that vibration, I'm thinking, if there's a possibility of those switches being loose, that vibration might have turned off those switches on its own, which is, again, I think it's a 1 in a billion probability that both of those switches vibrate themselves into off position. But I suspect the investigators would look into every single possibility. And I want them to do that because we owe it to everybody that lost their life, especially those pilots. They're dead. They're not here to defend themselves. So we must. And I go further, I would ask every 787 pilot in the world, tomorrow when you get into that cockpit, when you're sitting on the gate, or if you're in a simulator, touch those switches. You don't have to turn them off or turn it on. Make sure that spring is firm. And if you feel that spring is loose, write it up, call the maintenance right away. Because again, if there's that slight chance, we need to know that right away.
And for those, blaming the pilot already, why would a captain with 15,000 hours of experience put the fuel switch off right after takeoff? Is it possible to do so 3 seconds after takeoff for both the engines?
It's beyond my comprehension. You're absolutely correct. At that moment, even if your engines both fail, you still have a little bit of power to get up higher, because to turn that switch at that moment, 3 seconds after liftoff, is suicide. And one thing else I'm sure the investigators will look into is a possible, I hate to say the word, possible pilot suicide. I don't like to speculate, but investigators will look into everything, including a pilot suicide. And I definitely hate to say that word, but as a longtime pilot and sometime investigator, I would definitely look into just every possible thing.
Now, Captain Ross, does the fact that the FAA raised the issue against the fuel switch in 2018 show that there could be a technical glitch, a technical issue?
I must correct myself. That was not a warning issued by FAA. That was an advisory circular. It's called advisory. And it doesn't have much of a weight. It's voluntarily. In other words, they send it out to all 787 operators at that time. This was in December of 2018, I believe, that advisory circular came out. And because it was not mandatory, we have two types of advisories. There are ADs that you must comply with immediately or within a certain period of time. This was an advisory issue. You didn't have to do it if you didn't want to, but they just advised the operators. So this, I believe Air India did not pay any attention to it because it was not a mandatory thing. It would have been probably just go there and jiggle those switches, make sure they're firm. Because when they work normally, it's impossible to bump them. You have to lift the switch over a cam and drop it down. So it's impossible for it to come loose. But if that spring is broken, as I mentioned, or loose, there could be a possibility. That's why I'm saying that's why they issued, there must have been a case or two that for FAA to come out and say that. So that, and the fact that the investigators, AAIB and TSB, they all agreed to put that in the report, that's an important issue. I hope that they would look into everything.
Okay. Now, what part of further investigation, let me ask you, would be key in clarifying what led to the control switches being turned off? As you're saying, the investigators need to go into everything, and they should. They owe it to the families. What should be then the follow-up to this preliminary report on this aspect emerging of the switches, the fuel switches?
787, like most modern jet, has an incredible amount of information going to the flight data recorder. So, unfortunately for all of us, both flight and data recorders were recovered, and they were able to extract all the information from them. So the position of those switches and when and how it was, it's in that data. You have the voice recorder that records both pilots and other switches, any sound in the cockpit. They could go back and really concentrate on when those switches clicked. You could hear that in the voice. And one last thing that I like to add is that in the United States, because of the strong unions, we were able to add a third pilot for any flight over 8 hours. Any flight over 8 hours, two-man crew, it must be 3. Now you have an extra pilot. And this flight was, as you know, almost 10 hours. And unfortunately, Air India is still operating it under the two-man crew. So it was if there was a third pilot in that cockpit, he or she may have saved the day, because they're looking at both of these pilots and see what they're doing. And he or she would have said, before they touch that. What are you doing at this altitude? It's too early. 3 seconds past rotation, you turn off those switches. Might as well committed suicide, because there's no way in hell you can relight those engines in that short of a time and in that altitude, in that airspeed. So that's another extremely important thing that the investigators will look into. Yes, it's a part of the checklist, as I mentioned, memory item, in case you lose both engines. But do you need to do that fast, that quickly, before even raising the gear? Because once you turn off those switches, that's another thing. You can't raise the gear anymore. All of these things will be hopefully investigated by, I'm sure, competent people. They will interview other pilots that know these gentlemen, their families. They go into their history. What was their religious beliefs? What was their political views? All of these things will be investigated, I hope.
Okay, let me also then quickly ask you about, would you expect the final comprehensive report into this crash soon? And after this preliminary report, how long more before that final report comes out with some sort of final conclusion as well on what led to this crash?
ICAO has a rule, and Air India followed it, that says you have to come out within 30 days with a preliminary report. So that preliminary, as the word says, it's just a loosely investigated, quick, basically an answer. But if they want to do a real investigation, like I mentioned, to look into just about everything, it may take as much as 2 or 3 years. There's really no time limit on doing a good investigation. We want them to take time to do it perfectly, to do a correct investigation. So that may take a while. Now, it all depends, because we're fortunate enough that Indian government has allowed NTSB, Boeing, General Electric, and even ICAO to be involved in this. I like that. I like that these fellas will check each other and make sure nobody has any way to insert their own opinion for any reason. So it has to be scientific, completely scientific and fair and balanced, and they do the job to the best of their knowledge. And therefore, it may take a while.
Yes. Do you think there's any way of ensuring something like this does not happen again, that fuel engine switches don't go off at such low altitudes, Captain?
I used to say, and this is not my saying, it's in aviation from years ago, every procedure, every law, every rule in aviation is written in blood. In other words, somebody at some point made that mistake, and we learned about it, and now that mistake is in the books, so nobody else will make that error again. So I'm hoping that by finding out exactly what happened with this, there won't be a future occurrence of these fuel switches possibly turning themselves off, or an electronic signal in the engine control EECs, engine control computers, could have possibly done it too. So we don't know that. None of these things will be known until the entire investigation is done. The only good thing about this, as I mentioned earlier, about this pre-RIM report, is that all these other crazies are hopefully go away with their theories. It was either flap was not in position or fuel was contaminated. The report says precisely that wasn't the case. Fuel was okay. Temperature was hot, but that's normal for that takeoff. That's not a problem. Aircraft was not overweight. There was no rain shower. The weather was fine on takeoff. All of those theories on YouTube are disregarded, hopefully. But again, this report did not solve all the problems. In fact, it started a new thing, that how did those switches go off? That's the million-dollar question. And I don't know the answer.
You know, the 737s, those 737s, of course, also have faced several quality issues, even being grounded as well. What is your assessment of these aircraft, the 787s? Does this incident affect the credibility of that aircraft as well going forward?
Short answer, yes. Because 787, just like any other new airplane, has what we call teething problems. Any new airplane that has come out, Airbus, Boeing, even my old original airplane, the 707, initially they had some issues. If you remember with 787, they had the battery fire immediately after it was introduced, and they grounded the airplane. And there was also strong rumors from whistleblowers at Boeing, as you know, that some of the 787s were put together very poorly, especially the one that came out of the South Carolina plant. It's a non-union plant. There were some inexperienced people putting the airplane back in, and they discovered some issues in some of those airplanes, like with the pressure bulkhead or forcing two units together. These are the things that shouldn't happen in an airplane like 787. So to go back to what you asked, I think there are some issues with 787. On the other hand, this was the only crash from almost 1,200 airplanes, and they've been flying for a long time. So it has a very good safety record in that respect. But by no means I'm giving a pass to Boeing. So they're under scrutiny also. And I hope, again, that investigators even look further into 787 itself.
All right, Captain Rusty Amer, thank you very much for joining us with your perspective on that big story. Let's slip into a short break on that note. We're back on the other side with lots more.